It started with a sound no parent ever forgets, a cry that doesn't belong to the night. The phone rang once, twice, then a trembling whisper broke through the static. "Dad, they took me." For a moment, Detective James Carter couldn't breathe.
Hope is
The
here.
clock read
It
2:17
lives in all
a.m.,
of us.
but time
And
itself
together,
seemed to stop.
we will build
The kitchen
a
was
better
dark,
tomorrow.
the air heavy with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the bitter scent of stale coffee. He'd been up late working a cold case file, but now all he could hear was his daughter's voice. Fragile, panicked, breaking apart between sobs.
Hope is
"They
here.
think I stole
It lives
something,
in
Dad."
all of us.
"I didn't.
And together,
Please come."
we will
Then
build
came
a
the sharp
better
click of
tomorrow.
handcuffs. A man's voice shouted in the background. Then, silence. The world around him went still. For 22 years, James had worn that badge with pride. He had faced armed robbers, corrupt officials, cold-blooded killers. But nothing in all those years had prepared him for this. His only daughter, Maya, just 19, was calling him from a police station. Scared, alone, and accused of theft. He didn't even remember grabbing his badge or his keys. The next thing he knew, he was behind the wheel, sirens wailing in his chest, headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The city outside blurred. Empty streets, flickering streetlights, a faint drizzle hitting the windshield. Each mile felt heavier than the last. When he pushed through the glass doors of the station, the fluorescent lights hit him like interrogation beams. Every officer looked up. Some whispered, some looked away. And there, behind the glass wall of a holding cell, sat Maya. Her hair was tangled, her eyes swollen from crying. Mascara streaks traced the path of tears down her brown cheeks. Her wrists were red from the cold bite of metal. She looked like a child who'd seen the world turn against her overnight. Across the hall stood Officer Miller. Young, tall, nervous. A rookie James himself had trained. "Caught her at the mall," Miller said flatly, without meeting his eyes. "A stolen watch. We've got witnesses." The words hit James like a punch. "That's impossible," he muttered. "You know my daughter." "She was caught with it in her bag," Miller replied. "Policy says we detain first, verify later." James stepped closer to the cell. Maya looked up, her voice shaking. "Dad, I swear I didn't do anything. I just went to buy a dress for the scholarship dinner. I didn't even touch that watch." Her words came out between sobs. "They wouldn't listen. They pushed me, Dad. They said, 'People like me always say that.'" He froze. "People like me." The words stung in the space between them. James turned to Miller, his tone low and controlled, but edged with steel. "Did she resist?" "No," Miller said. But the store clerk insisted. "Said she looked suspicious." James clenched his fists. He wanted to shout, but the silence in the room felt more violent than any scream. He walked closer to the bars, his hand trembling as he touched the cold metal. "It's okay, baby. I'll fix this," he whispered. For the first time in his life, James Carter didn't know who he was. A detective sworn to uphold the law, or a father watching the same law crush his child. Maya reached through the bars, her fingers brushing against his. "Dad, why are they looking at me like that?" "Because they don't see you," he thought. "They only see what they've already decided you are." He looked over his shoulder. Officers were still whispering. The detective in him wanted to demand answers, review evidence, call the watch store himself. But the father in him, the man whose wife had been buried 3 years earlier, who had promised to keep their daughter safe, felt something darker, a rising fury. "Get her out," he said quietly. Miller hesitated. "Sir, we can't until—" "Get her out." But even his authority had limits now. A superior officer stepped forward. "James, I'm sorry, but it's standard procedure." "We can't make exceptions." "Exceptions?" he repeated. "You think this is about exceptions?" "That's my daughter." "Then you know the drill," the officer said coldly. "We can't treat her differently just because of who her father is." James turned away, his eyes wet with rage. "That's exactly what you're doing." He stood outside the holding cell as the minutes stretched into hours. Maya sat silently, her head down, whispering prayers to herself. Every now and then, a guard would walk by and stare too long. James saw it all, the judgment, the disgust, the smugness, the same look he had once seen on suspects he himself had interrogated. Now it was turned on her, on his daughter. When dawn finally came, the light through the glass was pale and cold. James sat on the bench outside the cell, exhausted. His badge felt heavier than ever, like a curse hanging from his chest. He stared through the bars, wondering how many fathers had sat in this same position, powerless, desperate, watching their children become statistics. He tried to piece it together. A stolen watch? Maya never wore jewelry, never even liked malls. Something didn't add up, but the reports weren't ready. The witnesses couldn't be reached. Every time he asked, he was told to wait. "Detective, we're doing our best," Miller said again, but his voice cracked. "Your best?" James whispered, his eyes locked on him. "You detained a child on hearsay. You didn't even check the footage." "It's protocol," Miller stammered. "Protocol," James repeated softly, as if tasting the word and realizing it was poison. He looked at Maya again, his daughter, his pride, his world. Her brown skin looked almost golden under the harsh lights, the same warm tone her mother had. His wife had faced the same judgment once. He remembered the looks she used to get when they walked into restaurants together. The comments whispered just low enough to pretend they weren't meant to hurt. He had spent his whole career believing that law could rise above prejudice, that justice was blind. But standing there, watching his daughter caged for something she didn't do, he saw the truth clearer than ever. Justice wasn't blind. It just chose who to see. He turned his badge over in his palm, feeling the engraved letters. The symbol that once made him proud now felt like a lie. The same system that had given him purpose had turned on his family without hesitation. When Maya looked up at him again, he saw it. The shift in her eyes, the moment innocence broke and something colder took its place. "Dad," she whispered, voice small and trembling. "Do you believe me?" He knelt down beside the bars, his voice breaking. "I've never believed anything more." And in that moment, something inside him hardened. The detective was gone. The father remained, wounded, burning, ready to fight. When he finally stepped outside, the morning rain hit his face like the world's apology. Too little, too late. The sky was gray, the streets quiet. He walked slowly to his car, drenched in silence. Somewhere behind him, his daughter sat in a cold cell. Her spirit dimmed but not broken. He opened the door, gripped the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. "Something's wrong," he whispered to himself. Then he started the engine, determination flooding his veins, because tonight, the man who had spent decades protecting everyone else's children was about to do something he'd never done before. He was going to protect his own. Not as a cop, but as a father, and nothing, not rank, not protocol, not fear, would stop him. Not fear, would stop him. By morning, the whisper had become a headline. "Detective's daughter arrested for theft." The words were everywhere. On the station bulletin, in text messages he wasn't supposed to see, murmured behind paper cups of coffee. James Carter, the department's golden man, the detective everyone once trusted, was now the father of a thief. Or so they said. The air in the precinct felt different now. Conversation stopped when he walked by. He could feel their eyes, the pity, the curiosity, and something worse. The quiet satisfaction of watching a man fall. He'd spent 22 years earning their respect, but all it took was one accusation against his daughter to turn him into a ghost. He walked straight into the evidence room, his voice hard. "Where's the footage?" The clerk looked up, startled. "The mall case. My daughter's case." "The report isn't ready, sir," the clerk mumbled. "Then make it ready," he said. Witnesses haven't been reached yet. The store's closed. We're still verifying statements. James stared at him. You had enough to arrest her last night. You can find a way to clear her this morning. But the man looked away. I'm just following orders, detective. Those words hit harder than any punch. Following orders. The phrase that always hid cowardice. James stormed out, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling foreign. He found Miller in the hallway, flipping through paperwork, pretending to be busy. You said you had proof, James said, his voice quiet but shaking with anger. Miller swallowed hard. We do, sir, but protocol says, protocol, James snapped, stepping closer. Protocol says you put handcuffs on a terrified girl without checking evidence? You think that's justice? Miller looked at the floor. She had the watch in her bag. And you think that's proof? James's voice cracked. You think my daughter, Maya, risked her whole future for a piece of jewelry? You trained under me, Miller. You know better than that. The younger man's silence was answer enough. Hours later, James walked down the cold corridor toward the holding cells. He wasn't wearing his badge now. He didn't want it. He felt like he didn't deserve it. Each step echoed through the hallway, heavy and hollow. Maya sat in the far corner of her cell. The fluorescent light flickered above her, casting shadows across her face. She didn't cry this time. She didn't even look up right away when she heard his footsteps. When she finally did, her eyes looked older, tired in a way no 19-year-old's eyes should ever look. Dad, she said softly, her voice breaking the silence like fragile glass. Why are they doing this? He stopped just outside the bars. His throat felt dry. We're going to fix it, he said, though his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. Maya shook her head. The guard said something. He said, People like me always lie. She looked down, her fingers tracing the lines of the cold metal bench. People like me, Dad. What does that even mean? He felt the words slice through him. He didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew. His mind flashed back to his wife, Maya's mother, laughing in the sunlight, her dark curls bouncing as she danced around the living room. He remembered the day they got married, how some of his colleagues didn't show up, how his captain had pulled him aside afterward and said, You know, this will make things harder for you, right? Back then, James had brushed it off. He thought the world was changing. He thought justice was bigger than color. But now, standing in front of his daughter's cell, he realized how wrong he'd been. The system he had sworn to protect was built on assumptions, and it had just swallowed his child whole. He knelt down, lowering his voice. Maya, I need you to hold on. I promise you, I'll get you out. She looked up, tears finally spilling again. But Dad, you're one of them. Why don't they believe you? The question hung in the air, heavy and cruel. He wanted to tell her that his badge still meant something, that good people would see reason. But he couldn't. Not when the truth was staring him in the face. A truth he'd ignored for years because it was easier to believe in the myth of fairness. He reached through the bars, brushing a tear from her cheek. They will, he whispered, though his voice trembled. They will. When he stepped outside again, the sky was gray and low. The kind of sky that feels like it's pressing down on you. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then harder, soaking his clothes as he stood under the awning. He didn't move. He just watched the rain blur the city into streaks of color, wondering how many fathers had stood right here, powerless, angry, and ashamed. Every instinct in him screamed to fight back, to storm into that office to make them see reason. But he also knew the rules. He'd written them, enforced them, defended them. Now those same rules were being used against him, and against the little girl who used to fall asleep on his lap while he told her bedtime stories about justice and heroes. He remembered one night, years ago when Maya was 7. She'd asked him why he became a cop. He told her, because someone has to make sure the bad guys don't win. And now, under the rain, He realized the bad guys weren't always the ones holding guns. Sometimes they wore the same uniform he did. He drove home in silence, but his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The house felt empty when he walked in. Her shoes still by the door, her favorite hoodie draped over the chair. He picked it up, held it for a moment, and felt the lump rise in his throat. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his badge lying on the counter. For the first time, it didn't look like honor. It looked like hypocrisy. The law he had believed in had turned its back on truth. He whispered to himself, "What good is justice if it forgets mercy?" Outside, thunder rumbled. The rain hit the windows like the world was crying with him. He thought about all the young black men and women he'd seen over the years, treated as suspects before being seen as people. He thought of the reports he'd signed, the arrests he'd justified. Maybe some of them had stories just like Maya's. Scared, unheard, pleading to someone who thought protocol was reason enough to destroy a life. He covered his face with his hands. For the first time in decades, Detective James Carter felt ashamed of his badge. When he finally lifted his head, the clock read 11:48 p.m. He hadn't moved for hours. The coffee pot was empty. The rain hadn't stopped. He whispered her name again. Maya, like a prayer, or maybe an apology. And as the lightning flashed through the kitchen window, he made a silent promise. He would find the truth, no matter what it cost. He would tear down every wall, question every man, challenge every rule if it meant proving her innocence. Because now, this wasn't just about a stolen watch. It was about something much bigger. The soul of the system he had dedicated his life to. The line between right and wrong had never looked so blurred. And somewhere between those lines stood a father who had finally realized that sometimes the hardest fight isn't for justice. It's for your own blood. For justice. It's for your own blood. James Carter couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at the faint light leaking through the blinds. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the storm still tapping against the windows. Every second that passed felt like a weight pressing deeper into his chest. His daughter's voice echoed over and over in his mind. They said people like me always lie. He replayed every word, every look, every hesitation from the officers he once trusted. The way Miller had avoided his eyes. The way the captain's tone had changed from concern to cold procedure. The same men who once stood beside him during raids now whispered about his daughter behind closed doors. The law he had defended for 22 years had turned its gaze on his child and looked at her not as a daughter, not as a person, but as a suspect. He got up, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and stared at the wall where his wife's photo still hung. She had that same calm strength Maya carried. Soft eyes, proud smile, a fire that never bowed to anyone. He remembered what she used to tell him whenever he came home late after a case. James, you can't fight darkness if you start to live inside it. He had always smiled at that. But tonight, he wasn't sure if he'd already become part of the darkness himself. Then, a single thought broke through the fog. The mall. Maya had gone there to buy a dress for her scholarship dinner, the same boutique she'd talked about all week. He remembered how excited she'd been. They have cameras in there, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. And in that instant, something clicked. James grabbed his keys and rushed out into the rain. The roads were slick and empty, streetlights blurring into golden streaks across the windshield. The city was still asleep, but his heartbeat wasn't. It thundered in his chest like a war drum. When he reached the boutique, the glass doors reflected his rain-soaked face back at him, the face of a man who no longer recognized himself. He knocked until a sleepy manager opened the door. The man looked startled. "Detective Carter? I need your security footage," James said, his voice steady but low. "Last night, around 9:30, a girl, my daughter, was arrested here. The manager hesitated. I don't think I can release that without a warrant. James took a slow step forward, his wet jacket dripping onto the floor. Then call whoever you have to. But you're going to show me that tape. His tone carried the kind of quiet force that made people listen. The manager nodded and led him inside. The store was still dark, racks of shimmering dresses standing like ghosts in the dim light. In the back office, the hum of computers filled the silence. The man inserted a small drive into the monitor, scrolling through the recordings. The footage flickered, customers browsing, cashiers smiling, quiet routine. Then, at 9:27 p.m., he saw her. Maya. She looked so normal, so calm. Her braids were tied back, her posture polite, her eyes bright with excitement. She was talking to the cashier, her card in hand, when another woman walked up beside her. Tall, blonde, dressed in a white designer coat. She smiled at Maya, even leaned close as if to compliment her dress. But then the woman's hand slipped into Maya's open shopping bag. A gold watch glinted for half a second before disappearing. James froze. His throat tightened. The woman looked around, then feigned shock, pointing at Maya as security guards rushed over. The video kept rolling, showing his daughter's confusion, her desperate attempts to explain. The guards never checked the woman's bag. They only looked at Maya. James pressed his hands against the desk. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. He could feel anger, guilt, and heartbreak twisting together inside him. There, he whispered. Right there. The manager's face paled. Detective, I didn't know. I thought. You thought wrong, James said quietly, eyes still fixed on the screen. He copied the footage onto a flash drive and left without another word. When he stepped back outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still felt gray. He drove straight to the precinct, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Every passing light reflected off the flash drive like a tiny beacon in the dark. Inside the station, whispers followed him again. But this time, he didn't hear them. He walked straight to Miller's desk and slammed the drive down. Play it, he said. Miller looked confused. Sir, now! He plugged it in, and the video began to play. The room fell silent. One by one, officers gathered behind them, drawn by the tension in James's voice. The footage rolled, the same moment replaying. Maya, the woman, the switch. By the end, no one could speak. When the screen went black, Miller's mouth hung open. Sir, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. James turned slowly, his voice trembling but cold. No, you didn't want to know. He stared at him for a long moment. You looked at her and saw guilt. You never even looked for truth. Miller tried to speak, but no words came. The shame in his eyes said everything. Within hours, everything changed. The woman in the white coat was identified, arrested, and charged with theft and false accusation. The department issued a public apology. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Words like misunderstanding and clerical error floated through the air, like poison disguised as politeness. Maya was released by evening. When James saw her step out of the holding area, his knees almost gave out. She ran to him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tighter than he ever had before. She smelled like cold air and fear. It's over, he whispered. You're free. But she shook her head softly. No, Dad, it's not. Her voice cracked. They looked at me like I was a criminal. Like I didn't belong here. James had no answer. He just held her, his eyes fixed on the same officers who now avoided his gaze. The same men who'd laughed with him at lunch just days ago now stood in silence, unsure of what to say. That night, when the paperwork was done and the cameras were gone, the two of them sat in his car in the empty parking lot. The city lights flickered outside, casting long reflections across the windshield. Maya turned to him. I thought being your daughter would protect me. He swallowed hard. It should have, he said softly. But sometimes The badge means nothing when the world has already decided what you look like. She stared out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to buy a dress. The words broke him. James started the engine, but neither of them spoke during the drive home. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things they both understood but didn't want to say. When they got home, Maya went straight to her room. James sat in the kitchen again, staring at his badge lying on the table beside the flash drive. He thought about all the cases he'd closed, all the criminals he'd caught, and wondered how many innocent faces he'd missed. The truth had set his daughter free, but it had also destroyed something in him, his faith in fairness, in the system, in himself. And as the night deepened, he realized that the real prison wasn't the one with bars and locks. It was the one built from silence, from bias, from the quiet belief that some people are less believable than others. Maya was home, but something sacred had been stolen. Trust. And no video footage in the world could ever bring that back. The morning sunlight crept softly through the curtains, but for James and Maya, it brought no warmth. The house was quiet, too quiet. The world outside was moving again. Car engines, birds, radios, ordinary life. But inside, time felt suspended, as if the air itself refused to move forward. Maya sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. Her eyes were swollen from the tears she'd tried so hard to hide. She wasn't crying anymore, but she wasn't calm either. There was something in her gaze now. A silent, unshakable strength forged from pain. James watched her from the doorway, still in his wrinkled shirt, his face lined with exhaustion. "You should eat something," he said softly. "I'm not hungry," she replied. He nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. Every word felt fragile, like glass about to break. He wanted to fix everything, to promise her that this would never happen again. But he couldn't lie to her. "Not anymore." She finally looked up at him. "Did you know, Dad, that this happens to people all the time?" He hesitated. "I knew, but I never felt it like this." Maya's voice was calm, but her words carried fire. "You didn't want to feel it. You believed in rules, in systems. You thought the badge meant justice." James closed his eyes for a moment. "Maybe I had to believe that. Otherwise, how could I keep doing what I do?" Maya took a deep breath. "You can't fix a system you refuse to see." Her words hit him like a blade, not cruelly, but with truth. He wanted to defend himself, to say he'd always done his best. But deep down, he knew she was right. He had seen signs before, complaints ignored, reports buried, victims dismissed, and he had chosen silence. Not out of malice, but out of comfort, out of faith in something that had never truly been fair. The phone rang suddenly, cutting through the tension. James answered. It was the chief. The department wanted him in for a meeting. "Urgent follow-up," they said. He looked at Maya. "I have to go." She nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Then go. But don't just sit there and take it this time." He nodded again, grabbed his jacket, and left. At the precinct, the air was thick with whispers and shame. Cameras were gone now. The world had already moved on to the next story. But the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Officers glanced at him from across the hall, some with guilt, some with pity, some with fear. He entered the conference room. The chief sat at the head of the table, flanked by two senior officers, men James had known for years. "Detective Carter," the chief began, his tone heavy. "We're conducting an internal review of the incident. Your daughter's case has brought attention. Not all of it good?" James sat down, expression unreadable. "You mean the department's reputation is at risk?" The chief sighed. "James, you have to understand. This isn't personal, but we need to be careful how this looks. The media's already painting this as a racial profiling issue. The mayor's office is on the line." James clenched his jaw. It is a racial profiling issue. The room went still. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady. You saw the footage. You saw what happened. My daughter was accused without evidence, without reason, because she didn't look like someone who could afford a gold watch. And you're sitting here talking about optics? The senior officer across the table shifted uncomfortably. We're just saying, no, James interrupted sharply. You're excusing. That's what we've been doing for years. Every time someone gets mistreated, every time someone gets silenced, we hide behind procedure. We followed protocol. We made a mistake. We didn't mean to. But those mistakes have names, faces. My daughter's one of them now. The chief looked away, fingers tapping the table. James, you're crossing a line. He stood slowly. No, the line was crossed the night you put cuffs on a 17-year-old girl without evidence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension. Finally, the chief exhaled. What do you want, James? I want change, he said simply. Not another memo, not another PR campaign. Real reform, training that actually means something, accountability that doesn't stop at convenience. I want every officer who laughed, who doubted, who ignored, to face what they did. The chief's eyes softened slightly. And if we can't promise that? James looked at him, old friend, old ally, and said the hardest words of his life. Then I'm done. By the time he got home, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in quiet golds and blues. Maya was sitting on the porch, headphones in, sketching in her notebook. She looked up as he approached. Did they listen? She asked. He sat beside her. Maybe, maybe not. But I said what I had to. Maya nodded, smiling faintly. That's something. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that wasn't heavy anymore. Just honest. James looked out at the horizon. You know, when I joined the force, I thought wearing the badge meant protecting people. I didn't realize how much protection some people never get. Maya turned to him. Then maybe it's time we start protecting them. Together. He smiled. The first real smile in days. Yeah, together. The sun dipped lower, and the last of its light stretched across their faces. In that quiet moment, they weren't detective and victim, or father and daughter who'd been broken by injustice. They were two people standing at the edge of truth, and deciding not to turn away. For the first time in a long while, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not peace. Not pride, but purpose. Not pride, but purpose. It began with a single post. A photo of Maya standing beside her father, outside the courthouse, holding a sign that read, "Justice isn't blind. It just chooses who to see." At first, it was just a ripple, a few shares, a few comments. But by evening, it became a wave. Thousands of people reposted her picture, sharing their own stories. Stories of false accusations, humiliation, and survival. People from every corner of the country. Mothers, fathers, teachers, students, all echoing one truth. This could have been my child. James sat in the living room, watching the headlines flash across the TV. His phone buzzed non-stop. Reporters, activists, lawyers. Everyone wanted a quote, an interview, a statement. But all he could think about was the night he'd first heard her voice through the static. "Dad, they took me." That sound still haunted him. Maya walked in quietly, her curls still damp from the rain outside. She looked older now, more certain of herself. Pain had aged her, but it had also sharpened her purpose. "They invited us to speak at the university tomorrow," she said softly. "They're hosting a panel on racial bias in policing." James didn't respond right away. He stared at the floor, lost in thought. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I'm not sure," she said, "but I'm going." He looked up at her, really seeing her. Not as his little girl, but as a young woman standing in her truth. The fear that once lived in her eyes was gone. In its place was something stronger, something unbreakable. The auditorium was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. On stage, under the bright lights, Maya adjusted the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "My name is Maya Carter," she began. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what happens every day. To people who don't have a detective for a father. To kids who don't have proof. To families who don't get an apology." There was silence in the room. The kind that listens. My father taught me to believe in the law. But that night, I learned something different. I learned that justice wears two faces. One for those it protects, and one for those it suspects. And if we don't talk about that, if we don't see that, then nothing changes. She glanced at her father in the front row. He sat still, his hands clasped together, eyes glistening with pride and pain. "I'm not angry anymore," she continued. "I'm awake." The audience erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but the kind that comes from the chest, from the soul. People stood, tears in their eyes, nodding at her courage. James wiped his face. He had faced criminals, politicians, and the worst of humanity. But nothing had ever moved him like hearing his daughter speak truth to power. That night, as they drove home, the world outside felt different. Billboards flashed her quote. Hashtags trended. Talk shows debated her words. But inside their car, it was quiet. Just the hum of the road and the rhythm of their breathing. James finally spoke. "I'm proud of you," Maya smiled faintly. "You should be proud of yourself, too. You didn't stay silent." He looked ahead at the open road. Silence was easier, but easy never changed anything. She leaned her head against the window, watching city lights blur into streaks of gold. "Do you think they'll really change, Dad?" "The system, I mean." James hesitated. "Change doesn't start with systems. It starts with people brave enough to break them open." They drove in silence after that. But it wasn't empty silence. It was full of understanding, of unspoken promises, of healing. Months passed. The Maya Carter Initiative grew faster than anyone imagined. They offered free legal aid to youth who couldn't afford representation, hosted workshops in schools, and trained officers on bias awareness. James returned, not as a cop, but as a mentor, a teacher, a voice for reform. One morning, a letter arrived. No address, no name. Just a note written in careful cursive. "I was the officer who booked your daughter that night. I didn't speak up. I'm sorry. I want to help now." James folded the letter slowly, his hands trembling. "Maybe," he whispered, "this is how it begins." A year later, Maya stood again before a crowd, this time at the dedication of a new youth center. On the wall behind her hung a plaque, the Carter Center for Justice. She took the microphone, her voice steady, confident. "This place isn't built on anger," she said. "It's built on lessons. My father once told me the hardest battles aren't against crime. They're against our own reflection. We all have to face who we've been, to decide who we'll become." She looked out at the faces, young, old, hopeful, weary, and smiled. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about recognition, seeing each other fully, listening, believing. The audience rose to their feet again, applause echoing through the hall. In the front row, James stood, tears streaking his cheeks, pride swelling in his chest, and for the first time in a long, long while, he felt peace. Not because the world was fixed, but because his daughter had found her power within it. Later that night, as they locked up the building, Maya turned to him. "You ever think about that night?" "Every day," he said. She smiled softly. "Me too. But not with pain anymore. More like gratitude." "Gratitude?" he repeated, surprised. She nodded. "If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have found my voice. And maybe you wouldn't have found yours." James looked up at the stars above the quiet city, his arm around her shoulder. Maybe that's how change works. It starts in pain, but ends in purpose. They stood there for a long moment, father and daughter, survivors and teachers, bathed in the soft light of something that felt like grace. Because sometimes the world needs to break before it can begin again. And sometimes the most powerful justice comes not from the courtroom, but from the heart that refuses to stay silent. Moral: true justice begins the moment we see each other not as suspects, but as souls.